My therapist broke confidentiality and told my abusive ex-husband where I was living because they were old college friends, and he convinced her I was the dangerous one. I'd been seeing Dr. Morrison for 6 months to deal with PTSD from my marriage to Derek, and she specialized in domestic violence survivors and came highly recommended by the women's shelter that helped me escape. I trusted her with everything. The restraining order, the safe house addresses I'd burned through, the new identity I was building, how Derek had put me in the hospital twice, how he'd threatened to kill me if I ever left. She listened and took notes and told me I was brave, and that I was doing the right thing. I'd been in my new apartment for 3 months in a different city with a different name on the lease, no social media, burner phone. I'd done everything right. Then one night I came home from my job at the library and found Derek sitting on my couch, and my blood went ice cold because the apartment door was locked when I came in, which meant he had a key. He smiled at me like we were old friends and asked if I missed him. I asked him how he found me, my voice shaking, already calculating distances. Door behind me, kitchen knives to the left, bedroom window that didn't open. He told me Dr. Morrison had given him my address because she was worried about me and thought I'd been lying to her about him. I couldn't believe my therapist would do that, but he explained that Dr. Morrison was his friend from college, that he'd known her for 20 years, and when he told her I'd been having psychotic episodes and making up abuse stories, she realized she needed to help him get me into treatment. I told him that wasn't true, that she knew what he'd done because I'd shown her the hospital records and the police reports. He pulled out his phone and said those were the reports where I'd attacked him, and he had to defend himself. Then he showed me emails from Dr. Morrison with all my session notes, descriptions of my delusions and paranoia, and how I couldn't accept responsibility for my own violence. My stomach dropped because I could see Dr. Morrison's professional address right there, forwarded session summaries, my new address highlighted in yellow. He said she did it because she cared and grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise, telling me we were going home and I was getting the help I needed. I yanked away and ran for the door, got it open and screamed for help. My neighbor Tom heard and came running, and Derek instantly let go, backing up with his hands raised, telling Tom I'd run away from a psychiatric facility and wasn't safe alone. I was crying, telling Tom that Derek was my abuser and I had a restraining order. Tom looked between us, clearly confused, and said he was calling the police. The cops arrived 10 minutes later, and I showed them my restraining order, showed them Derek was violating it by being there, and they arrested him on the spot. But that wasn't the end, because 2 days later, Dr. Morrison called me and said we needed to have a session to discuss my paranoid delusions about Derek. She'd reviewed my case with a colleague and believed I was experiencing a psychotic break and wanted to have me committed for my own safety. I recorded the call and asked her directly if she'd given Derek my address, and she admitted it, saying she had a duty to warn when a patient was a danger to others, that Derek had showed her evidence I was violent and unstable, that confidentiality didn't apply when someone was at risk. I reported her to the state licensing board that same day with the recording, the emails Derek had showed me, the police report from his arrest. The board launched an investigation, and it turned out Dr. Morrison and Derek had been more than college friends. They'd dated for 3 years and she'd introduced him to his first wife. When that marriage ended in divorce with a restraining order too, Dr. Morrison had believed his story that the wife was crazy. The board found that Dr. Morrison had violated HIPAA, breached confidentiality, and failed to recognize a conflict of interest. But their recommendation was just a $5,000 fine and mandatory ethics training. She could keep her license and keep practicing. Derek got 60 days in jail for violating the restraining order and was out in 40 with good behavior. 2 months after he was released, another one of Dr. Morrison's patients was murdered by her ex-husband, and it turned out Dr. Morrison had told him where to find her too, saying the husband seemed genuinely concerned, and she didn't want to violate his rights by refusing to help him locate his mentally ill wife. The patient's name was Jennifer, and she was 32 and had 2 kids. Her ex shot her in her driveway while the children watched from the car. That's when I knew reporting Dr. Morrison to the licensing board wasn't enough. We had to destroy her completely. The words sat heavy in my chest while I read the news article about Jennifer's death for the 3rd time that morning. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone, and I kept seeing her face in the photo they'd used, smiling at a birthday party with her kids on either side of her. She'd trusted Dr. Morrison, just like I had, and now her children had watched their father kill their mother because a therapist decided confidentiality was optional. My friend Maya from the women's shelter called me that afternoon and said she'd seen the news too. She asked if I was okay, and I told her I wasn't, that I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to being Jennifer, how the only difference between us was that Tom had heard me screaming and called the police fast enough. Maya said we needed to do something because Dr. Morrison was still practicing and still seeing domestic violence survivors, and it was only a matter of time before she gave another woman's address to another abusive ex. I called a lawyer the next morning, a woman named Patricia, who specialized in malpractice cases. Her office was downtown in one of those old buildings with creaky elevators and water-stained ceiling tiles. She listened to my whole story without interrupting once, and when I finished, she pulled out a legal pad and started writing. She said, "What Dr. Morrison did wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. And the fact that another patient had died made it even stronger. She asked if I still had the recording of Dr. Morrison admitting she'd given Derek my address, and I told her yes. I had it backed up in 3 different places because I was terrified of losing the only proof I had. Patricia said we needed to file a civil lawsuit against Dr. Morrison for breach of confidentiality, emotional distress, and endangerment. She also wanted to contact Jennifer's family about joining the lawsuit because having a wrongful death claim would make the whole case stronger. I asked how much this would cost, and she said she'd work on contingency, meaning she'd only get paid if we won, because cases like this were exactly why she became a lawyer in the first place. That night I couldn't sleep and kept replaying the moment I'd opened my apartment door to find Derek on my couch. The way he'd smiled like he had every right to be there. The way he'd showed me those emails from Dr. Morrison like he was proud of outsmarting me. I got up around 2 a.m. and started writing everything down in a notebook, every detail I could remember from my sessions with Dr. Morrison, every time I'd told her about Derek's violence, every document I'd shown her proving I was telling the truth. Maya came over the next morning with coffee and bagels and found me still writing. She read through what I'd documented and said it was important to get all of this down while it was fresh. She also said the other women at the shelter wanted to help, that several of them had therapists who'd dismissed their abuse or sided with their abusers, and maybe this could be bigger than just my case. We spent the rest of the day calling everyone we knew who'd had experiences with therapists, not believing them or breaking confidentiality. By the end of the week, we had statements from 11 women who'd been failed by mental health professionals in similar ways. One woman's therapist had told her husband she was planning to leave and he'd broken her arm. Another woman's counselor had recommended couples therapy with her abuser because she thought the relationship could be saved. A third woman's psychiatrist had reduced her anxiety medication because he thought she was exaggerating her fear of her ex. Patricia reviewed all the statements and said this was exactly what we needed to show a pattern in the mental health field of not taking domestic violence seriously. She filed our lawsuit on a Tuesday morning, and by that afternoon the local news had picked up the story. A reporter named Lisa called and asked if I'd be willing to do an interview, and I said yes because I wanted everyone to know what Dr. Morrison had done. The interview aired 3 days later, and I sat on my couch watching myself on TV talking about how my therapist had given my address to the man who'd put me in the hospital. The segment included a photo of Jennifer and mentioned that she'd also been Dr. Morrison's patient. My phone started buzzing immediately with messages from people I hadn't talked to in years, some supportive and some calling me a liar who was trying to ruin an innocent woman's career. Derek's mother left me a voicemail saying I was a vindictive person who couldn't accept that her son had tried to help me and that I was making up stories to avoid taking responsibility for my own mental illness. I saved the voicemail and sent it to Patricia because it proved that Derek's whole family believed his version of events where I was the crazy one. Dr. Morrison's lawyer sent a cease and desist letter the next week threatening to sue me for defamation if I continued to make false statements about her professional conduct. Patricia read it and laughed, saying it was a standard intimidation tactic, and we had proof of everything I'd said. She sent back a letter that included the recording of Dr. Morrison admitting she'd given Derek my address and copies of the emails Derek had showed me with Dr. Morrison's session notes. The state licensing board scheduled a formal hearing for 6 weeks out, and Patricia said this was good because it meant they were taking the complaint seriously. She helped me prepare by going over my timeline again and again, making sure I could describe exactly what happened in each therapy session and what I'd told Dr. Morrison about Derek's violence. We practiced answering hostile questions from Dr. Morrison's lawyer, who would definitely try to make me look unstable or vindictive. Jennifer's parents contacted Patricia 2 weeks before the hearing and said they wanted to join the lawsuit. Her mother got on the phone with me and cried while describing how her grandchildren had nightmares every night and how her daughter had been trying so hard to build a new life away from her ex. She said if Dr. Morrison had just kept Jennifer's address confidential like she was supposed to, her daughter would still be alive. The hearing was in a bland conference room at a government building with fluorescent lights that buzzed and made my head hurt. Dr. Morrison sat on one side with her lawyer, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who kept shuffling papers. I sat on the other side with Patricia, and we waited while the board members filed in and took their seats at a long table. The board chair explained that they'd reviewed my complaint and Dr. Morrison's response and now wanted to hear testimony from both sides. I went first and described how I'd been seeing Dr. Morrison for 6 months, how I'd trusted her with everything about my abusive marriage, how she'd seemed supportive and professional. Then I described coming home, to find Derek in my apartment and him telling me that Dr. Morrison had given him my address because they were old college friends. Dr. Morrison's lawyer objected and said there was no proof his client had actually given Derek my address, that I was relying on the word of an ex-husband I'd accused of abuse, which wasn't credible evidence. Patricia stood up and asked if she could play the recording, and the board chair said yes. The room went quiet while we listened to Dr. Morrison's voice on my phone admitting she'd given Derek my address because she believed I was a danger to others and confidentiality didn't apply. One of the board members asked Dr. Morrison directly if that was her voice on the recording, and she said yes, but that she'd been trying to help, that Derek had showed her concerning evidence about my mental state, that she'd consulted with a colleague who agreed she had a duty to warn. Patricia asked what colleague she'd consulted, and Dr. Morrison hesitated before saying she couldn't remember their name, which made the board members exchange looks. The hearing lasted 4 hours, and by the end, I was exhausted and shaking. Patricia said I'd done well and that the recording was the key piece of evidence that proved everything I'd claimed. We left the building and she bought me lunch at a diner across the street where I could barely eat because my stomach was in knots. 3 weeks later, the board issued their decision and found that Dr. Morrison had violated multiple ethical standards, including confidentiality, failure to recognize conflicts of interest, and failure to properly assess risk before breaking confidentiality. Their punishment was a $10,000 fine, mandatory ethics training, and a formal reprimand on her record. She could still practice, but would be monitored for 2 years. I called Patricia immediately and asked why Dr. Morrison wasn't losing her license, and Patricia explained that state boards rarely revoke licenses on first offenses, even serious ones, because therapists have powerful unions and legal protections. She said the formal reprimand was actually significant because it would show up in any background checks and other patients could find it, but it didn't feel like enough when Jennifer was dead and Dr. Morrison was still seeing patients. Maya organized a protest outside Dr. Morrison's office the following week, and about 30 women from the shelter and surrounding area showed up with signs. We stood on the sidewalk chanting about patient safety, and several of Dr. Morrison's current patients saw us and came over to ask what was happening. I told them about Jennifer and about my own experience and watched their faces change as they realized their therapist had given a patient's address to her abuser. 2 of Dr. Morrison's patients quit on the spot, and one of them, a woman named Sarah, asked if she could join our lawsuit because Dr. Morrison had also broken her confidentiality by calling her ex-husband to discuss her therapy without permission. Patricia said yes, and added Sarah as a plaintiff, which made our case even stronger. The local news covered the protest, and this time they interviewed Jennifer's mother, who held up a photo of her daughter and said that Dr. Morrison's license should be permanently revoked because she'd proven she couldn't be trusted with vulnerable patients. The segment went viral, and suddenly our small local story was being shared across the country with people commenting about their own experiences with therapists who'd failed them. Dr. Morrison hired a PR firm to manage the backlash, and they released a statement saying she was a dedicated professional who'd made a judgment call in good faith to protect someone she believed was at risk. The statement said she deeply regretted that her actions had unintended consequences, but maintained she'd acted within her professional discretion. The comments on the statement were brutal, with hundreds of people pointing out that getting your patient killed wasn't an unintended consequence. It was the result of gross negligence. Patricia filed our civil lawsuit 6 weeks after the licensing board hearing and included Jennifer's wrongful death claim, my claim for emotional distress and endangerment, and Sarah's claim for breach of confidentiality. The total damages we were seeking came to $15 million, which Patricia explained was calculated based on Jennifer's lost future earnings, the therapy costs for her traumatized children, my ongoing PTSD treatment, and punitive damages to send a message that this behavior was unacceptable. Dr. Morrison's lawyer filed a motion to dismiss, claiming we hadn't proven actual damages, and that Dr. Morrison had acted in good faith based on information provided by Derek. Patricia filed a response that included the recording, the emails, testimonies from 3 ethics experts who said Dr. Morrison had grossly violated standards of care, and documentation of Jennifer's death. The judge denied the motion to dismiss and set a trial date for 8 months out. Those 8 months were brutal, because Dr. Morrison's legal team started digging into every aspect of my life looking for anything they could use against me. They subpoenaed my medical records from the hospitals where Derek had put me, my employment records, my financial records, even my college transcripts. Patricia said this was normal in civil cases, but it felt like being violated all over again, having strangers pour through the worst moments of my life looking for ways to discredit me. They found an old social media post from 4 years ago where I'd joked about being crazy and used it to argue I was mentally unstable. They found a traffic ticket from 2019 and tried to paint me as someone who didn't respect rules. They even contacted my former boss from a restaurant job I'd had in college, who said I'd called in sick a few times, which they claimed proved I was dishonest. Patricia objected to most of it, and the judge agreed that a traffic ticket and calling in sick to work had no bearing on whether Dr. Morrison had breached confidentiality. My deposition was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in Dr. Morrison's lawyer's office, and it lasted 6 hours. He asked me the same questions over and over in slightly different ways, trying to get me to contradict myself. He asked why I'd stayed with Derek for so long if he was really abusive. He asked if I'd ever hit Derek back during our fights. He asked if I'd ever exaggerated symptoms to get attention from doctors. Patricia objected to most of the questions, but I still had to answer, and by the end I was crying and shaking and felt like I'd been put on trial for being abused. Dr. Morrison's deposition happened 2 weeks later, and Patricia sent me the transcript because she thought I'd want to read it. Dr. Morrison testified that Derek had seemed genuinely concerned about my welfare when he contacted her. She said he'd showed her text messages where I'd threatened to hurt myself and medical records showing I'd been prescribed psychiatric medication. She said based on that evidence, she believed I was experiencing a mental health crisis and that Derek was trying to get me appropriate care. Patricia's notes in the margins pointed out that Dr. Morrison had never asked to see my full medical records or contacted my prescribing psychiatrist to verify Derek's claims. She'd taken the word of a man she'd dated 20 years ago over her own patient, who'd been seeing her for 6 months and had shown her documented evidence of abuse. The deposition also revealed that Dr. Morrison had never documented her decision to break confidentiality in my file, which was a massive red flag that suggested she knew what she was doing was wrong. Sarah's deposition described how Dr. Morrison had called her ex-husband to discuss Sarah's therapy sessions without getting Sarah's permission first. Dr. Morrison had told the husband that Sarah was struggling with the separation and might be open to reconciliation, which led to the husband showing up at Sarah's workplace and harassing her. Sarah had quit therapy immediately and filed a complaint with the licensing board that had been dismissed because Dr. Morrison claimed she'd misunderstood Sarah's wishes. Jennifer's parents gave their depositions together, and her mother could barely speak through her tears while describing the phone call from the police saying her daughter had been shot. Her father testified about his grandchildren's trauma and how they'd been in therapy 3 times a week since witnessing their mother's murder. He said the children had nightmares and panic attacks and had asked him repeatedly why their therapist had told their father where to find their mother. The trial started on a cold Monday in February, and the courthouse was packed with reporters and supporters from the domestic violence community. Dr. Morrison arrived in a conservative suit, with her hair pulled back, trying to look professional and sympathetic. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Patricia, while Jennifer's parents sat right behind us and Sarah sat next to them. Patricia's opening statement laid out the facts in devastating detail. How Dr. Morrison had violated confidentiality not once but multiple times with 3 different patients. How she'd taken the word of abusers over their victims. How her actions had directly led to Jennifer's death and put both Sarah and me in danger. How she'd failed to follow basic ethical guidelines and then lied about consulting with colleagues. Patricia showed the jury the recording of Dr. Morrison admitting she'd given Derek my address, and several jurors looked shocked. Dr. Morrison's lawyer gave his opening statement painting her as a dedicated therapist who'd made a difficult judgment call in good faith. He said Derek had presented compelling evidence that I was a danger to myself and that Dr. Morrison had a legal and ethical duty to act. He said Jennifer's death was a tragedy, but that Dr. Morrison couldn't have known her ex-husband would become violent. He said Sarah had misunderstood Dr. Morrison's intentions and that the phone call to her ex had been an attempt at therapeutic intervention. I testified on day 2, and Patricia walked me through my entire history with Derek and with Dr. Morrison. I described the violence, the hospitalizations, the restraining order, the documentation I'd provided to Dr. Morrison proving everything I'd said was true. I described coming home to find Derek in my apartment and the terror of realizing my therapist had betrayed me. I described the ongoing nightmares and panic attacks and my inability to trust any mental health professional now. Dr. Morrison's lawyer cross-examined me for 3 hours and tried to make me look like an unreliable narrator. He asked if I'd ever lied to Dr. Morrison about anything, and I said no. He asked if I'd been on psychiatric medication during my marriage, and I said yes, for depression and anxiety caused by the abuse. He asked if I'd ever had suicidal thoughts, and I said yes, when I was trapped in an abusive marriage and felt hopeless. He tried to use my own trauma symptoms as proof I was unstable, but Patricia objected repeatedly, and the judge sustained most of her objections. Sarah testified on day 3 and described her experience with Dr. Morrison calling her ex-husband. She said she'd never given permission for that call and had explicitly told Dr. Morrison she was afraid of her ex and wanted no contact. She said Dr. Morrison had dismissed her fears and said reconciliation was always worth trying. She described her ex showing up at her workplace and cornering her in the parking lot, telling her that her therapist had said she wanted to get back together. Jennifer's mother testified on day 4, and the entire courtroom was silent while she spoke. She described her daughter's struggle to leave her abusive marriage and rebuild her life. She described how Jennifer had trusted Dr. Morrison and felt safe telling her everything. She described the phone call from the police and rushing to the hospital where her daughter was already dead. She described her grandchildren's trauma and how they'd asked her why nobody had protected their mother. The prosecution's expert witness was a psychiatrist named Dr. Chen, who specialized in ethics and professional standards. He testified that Dr. Morrison had violated multiple ethical guidelines, including the fundamental principle of confidentiality. He said therapists can only break confidentiality in very specific circumstances, and none of those circumstances had been present in any of the 3 cases. He said Dr. Morrison's failure to document her decision to break confidentiality suggested she knew she was acting unethically. Dr. Morrison testified on day 6 and maintained she'd acted appropriately based on the information she had. She said Derek had been persuasive and had shown her evidence that made her believe I was in crisis. She said she genuinely believed she was helping by giving him my address so he could get me into treatment. When Patricia asked why she hadn't contacted my prescribing psychiatrist to verify Derek's claims, Dr. Morrison said she'd trusted Derek's evidence and hadn't thought it was necessary. Patricia then played a portion of Dr. Morrison's deposition, where she'd admitted Derek was an old friend and they'd dated in college. She asked Dr. Morrison if that relationship had influenced her decision to believe him over me, and Dr. Morrison insisted it hadn't, that she'd made a professional judgment based on evidence. Patricia asked why Dr. Morrison had never mentioned this conflict of interest to me, and Dr. Morrison said she hadn't thought it was relevant because her relationship with Derek was so long ago. The defense's expert witness was a psychologist who argued that therapists often have to make difficult judgment calls in ambiguous situations. He said, "Dr. Morrison had been presented with conflicting information and had chosen to err on the side of caution by involving Derek." Patricia's cross-examination tore him apart by pointing out that choosing to believe an abuser over a victim isn't erring on the side of caution, it's putting the victim in danger. The jury deliberated for 2 days, and when they came back, the 4 women stood and read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Breach of confidentiality for all 3 plaintiffs. Negligence leading to Jennifer's wrongful death. Emotional distress for Sarah and me. The damages totaled $12 million, with $8 million going to Jennifer's family, $3 million to me, and $1 million to Sarah. Dr. Morrison's face went white, and she grabbed the table to steady herself. Jennifer's mother sobbed, and her father held her while the judge read the full verdict. Patricia squeezed my hand and told me we'd won, that Dr. Morrison would never be able to do this to anyone else. The licensing board held an emergency hearing 2 weeks after the verdict, and this time they voted to permanently revoke Dr. Morrison's license. The board chair said the jury verdict and the pattern of behavior across 3 patients made it clear Dr. Morrison couldn't be trusted with the responsibility of patient care. Dr. Morrison's lawyer argued she deserved a chance to continue practicing with oversight, but the board voted 5-0 to revoke permanently. Dr. Morrison filed for bankruptcy 3 weeks later, claiming she couldn't pay the $12 million judgment. Patricia said this was common and that we'd probably only collect a fraction of the total amount, but that wasn't really the point anymore. The point was that Dr. Morrison's career was over and her license was revoked, and everyone knew what she'd done. Maya and I started a nonprofit called Therapy Accountability Now that provided resources for domestic violence survivors looking for therapists and tracked complaints against mental health professionals. We created a database where people could report therapists who'd violated confidentiality or sided with abusers. Within 6 months, we had over 200 reports and had connected dozens of women with lawyers who could help them file complaints. Sarah joined our board of directors and helped us develop training materials for therapists about recognizing abuse and protecting victim confidentiality. We did presentations at psychology graduate programs and professional conferences. We lobbied state legislatures to strengthen confidentiality protections and require therapists to undergo domestic violence training. Jennifer's parents used their portion of the settlement to create a scholarship fund for her children and to fund domestic violence prevention programs in their community. They spoke at our events and shared Jennifer's story to help other women understand the importance of finding trustworthy therapists. I still have nightmares about coming home to find Derek in my apartment, but they're getting less frequent. I see a new therapist now, one who specializes in trauma and who I vetted extensively before our first session. It took me 8 months to trust her enough to share anything real, but she's been patient and hasn't pushed me. Derek violated his probation 6 months after his release and got sent back to jail for another year. His mother still sends me messages blaming me for ruining his life, but I block her every time. Dr. Morrison moved to another state and tried to get licensed there, but our database flagged her application and we sent the licensing board information about her revocation and the lawsuit. They denied her application. She tried again in 2 more states with the same result. Last I heard, she was working as a life coach, which doesn't require a license, and I've reported her to consumer protection agencies in her state for misleading advertising. Tom, my neighbor who called the police that night, became a good friend. He checks on me regularly and helped me install better locks and a security system. He said he still felt guilty for hesitating before calling the police, and I told him he'd saved my life by acting when he did. The women's shelter where I'd stayed asked me to speak at their fundraiser, and I shared my story with 300 people. Several women came up to me afterward and said they'd had similar experiences with therapists not believing them or breaking confidentiality. We exchanged contact information and added them to our growing network of survivors working to hold the mental health field accountable. 3 other women filed complaints against Dr. Morrison after our trial, emboldened by the verdict and the publicity. Their cases were all referred to the State Attorney General's Office for criminal investigation of whether Dr. Morrison's pattern of breaking confidentiality rose to the level of criminal negligence. The investigation is still ongoing. I'll never get back the sense of safety I lost when I found Derek in my apartment. I'll never fully trust a therapist the way I trusted Dr. Morrison before she betrayed me. But I can make sure other women know to ask questions about their therapist's policies on confidentiality and conflicts of interest. I can make sure licensing boards take complaints seriously. I can make sure women like Jennifer don't die because their therapist valued an old friendship over a patient's life. Dr. Morrison is unemployed, bankrupt, and permanently unable to practice therapy. Derek is in jail. Jennifer's children are in therapy and slowly healing. And I'm still here, still fighting, still making sure what happened to us never happens to anyone else. Thanks for wandering through all this with me today. It's been quite a journey asking questions together. Until next time, and hey, like the video.